I lock myself in the basement sometimes. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are 10 people who were locked in the basement and forgotten about. Anyways, let's get a search warrant. Number 10. The Ariel Castro kidnappings. Between 2002 and 2004, Ariel Castro kidnapped Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Georgia Gina DeJesus from the streets of Cleveland. Upon being kidnapped, Castro took Michelle Knight to the upper floor of his house, tied her hands and feet together, and pulled her up using her hands, feet, and neck. He left her there for 3 days without food. Prosecutors at Castro's sentencing wrote that diaries kept by his victims speak of forced intimate conduct, of being locked in a dark room, of anticipating the next session of abuse, of the dreams of someday escaping and being reunited with family, of being chained to a wall, of being held like a prisoner of war, of missing the lives they once enjoyed, of emotional abuse, of his threats to end, of being treated like an animal, of continuous abuse, and of desiring freedom. The women were kept in locked bedrooms, where they were forced to use plastic toilets that were emptied infrequently. They were fed one meal a day and allowed to shower twice a week at most. According to a statement from the CDP, officers visited Castro's home only once following the kidnappings to discuss an unrelated incident. Castro did not appear to be home at the time and was interviewed later somewhere else. Neighbors claim to have called the police about suspicious activity observed at the home, but police have said they have no record of any such calls. Castro's son Anthony reported that there were certain areas of the house that were locked and inaccessible. He also mentioned an occasion 3 weeks before the women's escape when Castro asked him if Berry would ever be found. Anthony said that he told Castro that Berry had likely passed away, to which Castro responded, "Really? You think so?" Number 9. The Nobuyuki Sato kidnapping. Fusako Sano disappeared on November 13, 1990 after watching a school baseball game in her hometown of Sanjo, Niigata Prefecture, Japan. Police even considered the possibility that she had been kidnapped by North Korean intelligence operatives. She'd been kidnapped by Nobuyuki Sato, then a 28-year-old mentally disturbed, unemployed Japanese man who forced her into his car and subsequently held her in the upstairs floor of his apartment in a residential area of Kashiwazaki, Niigata Prefecture, for 9 years and 2 months. The house is only 200 meters from a koban police substation and 55 kilometers from the location where she was kidnapped. While Sano was initially scared, according to her own statements, she eventually just gave up and accepted her fate. Allegedly, Sato kept her tied up for several months and used a stun gun for punishments if she did not videotape horse races on television. Sano was also threatened with a knife and beatings. Her kidnapper shared his men's clothes with her and gave her food 3 times per day, either instant food or meals cooked by his mother, who lived downstairs in the house. He also cut Sano's hair, since there was no bath or toilet upstairs where Sano was confined. She was only able to take a bath infrequently when permitted by her captor. She spent most of her time in captivity listening to the radio and reportedly was allowed to watch TV only in the last year of her ordeal. While the door was never locked, Sano did not take a step outside for 9 years. She later told the police, "I was too scared to escape and eventually lost the energy to escape." Sato's mother lived downstairs and apparently had no contact with her son's captive since he became very violent whenever she tried to go upstairs. However, police believe the mother must have had some knowledge of Sano's presence. For example, it was alleged that she purchased feminine hygiene products for the victim. Number 8. 24 years underground. In the rural town of Amstetten, Austria, 18-year-old Elisabeth Fritzl was reported missing by her father Joseph Fritzl in 1984. But she wasn't missing. Her father, who had been sharing her since she was 11 years old, had lured her into the cellar and locked her in. He forced her to write a runaway letter which he showed to her mother and police to convince everyone she was gone. Since she was 18 and the letter said not to look for her and that she had joined a cult, there wasn't really much police could do. Fritzl kept his daughter in a windowless, completely soundproof prison beneath the home that was only accessible from a small door hidden in a cabinet. To make matters worse, his wife, Elizabeth's mother, was clueless about all of it. Doctors sent out a public plea asking for Elizabeth, still believed to be off wandering and maybe in a cult, to come forward so that she could take her daughter's medical history. Fritzl brought his daughter to the hospital, claiming she had just showed up on his doorstep in response to the public plea. Number 7. Sylvia Likens. Gertrude Baniszewski was paid to care for sisters Sylvia and Jenny Likens while their parents were traveling as carnival workers. The Baniszewski family physically and verbally abused until the focus shifted solely to Sylvia. Sylvia was kept locked in the basement, eating only scraps. Everyone was told that she had been run off with some men. Baniszewski even forced Sylvia to write a letter to her parents confirming these lies. In October 1965, Sylvia Likens passed in the basement. Her official cause of demise was brain hemorrhaging. After finding her victim gone, Baniszewski concocted a story for the police claiming that Sylvia had been attacked by a group of young men. However, when the police came to investigate, Jenny took this opportunity to say, "Get me out of here, I'll tell you everything." Gertrude Baniszewski and her daughter were both sentenced to life in prison. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. were sentenced from 2 to 21 years in prison for the roles they played in the abuse. Number 6. Shawn Hornbeck. Shawn Hornbeck was kidnapped while riding his bike to a friend's house near Richwoods, Missouri. Shawn had taken this path many times before, but this time Shawn passed by Mike Devlin, who bumped him with his truck. Devlin initially seemed concerned for Shawn's safety, but moments later put him into the back of the truck and told him, "You were just at the wrong place at the wrong time." Shawn's parents, Pam Akers and stepfather Craig Akers, focused all of their time looking for their son. Both Shawn's mother and stepfather spent all of their money and retirement savings looking for Shawn and paying investigators to help aid the police. Shawn would remain missing for 4 years. Devlin decided to kidnap Ben Ownby on January 8, 2007. This time a neighbor saw Devlin's truck and knew something was wrong when she saw Ben crying and the truck peeling out from the bus stop. The neighbor was able to give the police a description of the white truck, and the FBI was able to link the truck to Devlin relatively quickly. When the FBI came to Devlin's house to question him about the kidnapping, Devlin seemed distant and nervous and kept referring to his godson named Shawn that he had to return to. The FBI quickly realized that the Shawn that Devlin was referring to was Shawn Hornbeck. Devlin pled guilty to all counts and was sentenced to 72 life terms. Number 5. Colleen Stan. Colleen Stan was hitchhiking when 23-year-old Cameron Hooker and his 19-year-old wife Janice picked her up, drove her to a secluded wooded area, and pulled out a knife. Hooker forced Colleen to wear a blindfold and gag, and then he strapped a 20-pound wooden box around her head. The next time the car stopped, they were at the home where Colleen would remain a prisoner for the next 7 years. Cameron would place her in a small coffin-like box at bedtime and slide her underneath his bed. Colleen was brainwashed into believing Hooker was a part of some larger organization called The Company, and if she tried to escape, the company would get her. For most of her captivity, Colleen spent her time in that box under the bed. This was continued until Janice decided she wanted to get her husband help, so she helped Colleen escape. Cameron was found guilty and was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Number 4. Sabine Dardenne. Mark Dutroux and his wife Michelle Martin may have seemed like a normal couple to their neighbors, but little did anyone know the couple was keeping a girl captive in their home, and Dutroux was a serial ender Belgian authorities had been looking for. Dutroux snatched Sabine when she was out on a bike ride and locked her up in the basement. She was abused repeatedly for the 80 days she spent chained up in his home. It was after he kidnapped Letitia Delhez that he was placed at the scene because his car was recognized. Police never got a confession out of Dutroux, but they had enough evidence to give him life in prison. His wife and accomplice Michelle Martin was sentenced to 30 years in prison. She only served 16 years before being released. Number 3. Natascha Kampusch. In 1998, Natascha Kampusch was dragged into a van and her whereabouts wouldn't be known for 8 years. Wolfgang Priklopil kidnapped Natascha. Natascha was forced to cater to all Priklopil's OCD-driven whims. If she did so much as leave a fingerprint behind, he would beat her. He didn't want her leaving stray hairs around, so he made her wear a plastic bag over her hair, and then he eventually shaved all her hair off. One day, and while he turned his back to take a call, she made a break for it. She ran as fast as she could to get someone to call the police. She was finally rescued. Priklopil ended his own life before he could be apprehended by jumping in front of a train. Number 2. J.C. Duggard. It would seem the people living near registered offender Philip Garrido weren't aware of his criminal history, and their mother was J.C. Duggard, when Garrido shocked her with a stun gun and kidnapped her in 1991. He locked her up in his home and then began abusing her, impregnating her twice. It was Garrido's wife Nancy who had actually chosen J.C. J.C. was locked in a tiny soundproof storage unit, then eventually moved to a bigger one where she remained handcuffed to the bed. J.C. wasn't served a warm meal until her first pregnancy. By the time J.C. was allowed out of the house, she was going by the name Alyssa and didn't want to admit to what had been happening to her. She was suffering from severe Stockholm Syndrome and tried to cover for Garrido. On August 26, 2009, when the Garridos went to a parole meeting, they broke Garrido and he confessed to everything. JC was able to return home and the Garridos were charged with 29 felony counts, including kidnapping, abuse, and false imprisonment. Nancy was sentenced to 34 years to life and Philip was sentenced to 431 years in prison. Thankfully, JC and her daughters were able to heal, move on, and create fulfilling lives. Number 1. 30 years of forced labor. A 73-year-old British man, Aravindan Balakrishnan, and his wife, 67-year-old Chanda Patni, kept 3 women as slaves in their home for 30 years. The 3 women, Aisha Wahab, Josephine Haraville, and Rosie Davies, were finally freed when police were given the address and showed up to the eerily normal-looking home in a neighborhood just like any other on October 25th, 2013. It was the last place anyone expected to find 3 terrified and brainwashed women being held against their will for most of their lives. The women were all so badly emotionally and physically abused that they wouldn't even try escaping. Balakrishnan was the former leader of the Workers' Institute of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. This was where he and 2 of the women met and where the brainwashing began. Rose, the youngest, allegedly fell out of a window in a commune with the people who became her daughter's captors. An organization called the Freedom Charity was responsible for tipping off the police to the situation. They had received a call on October 18th from a woman who said she'd been held against her will for over 30 years and that there were 2 other women trapped with her. Thanks for watching.